For backing my fiancé after my dad withdrew our wedding money over a prenup demand? I'm Ashley, 36, and money was never the thing my family argued about directly. In my family, money was called responsibility, gratitude, planning, standards, or knowing where you came from. My dad, Howard, had a way of making financial involvement sound like a moral obligation. If he paid for something, he had an opinion about it. If he invested in something, he expected access. If he gave advice and you ignored it, the disagreement was rarely about the decision itself. It became a question of whether you respected the family. For a long time, I didn't think it was controlling. Part of the reason was that my dad had often been right. When I was in my 20s, I almost signed on to a loan with terms I didn't fully understand because I was embarrassed to admit that I didn't understand them. Dad looked through the paperwork, pointed out a variable rate clause and 2 fees I had missed, and told me not to sign. He was right. That deal would have cost me far more than I realized. There were other moments like that. He had good instincts about contracts. He understood leverage. He was patient with paperwork in a way I wasn't. When my younger sister, Brooke, and I inherited minority interests in a family investment partnership from our grandfather, Dad handled most of the administrative side. I signed what needed signing, read the annual summaries, and let my distributions roll back into the partnership because that was what everyone had always done. I told myself that being independent meant I could say no if I needed to. The problem was that I almost never said no in a way that cost him anything. Then I met Gavin. Gavin was also 36 when we got married. He had none of the things Dad used as shorthand for financial seriousness. He drove an older SUV that he kept repairing because, in his words, it still starts, stops, and carries lumber. He wore the same watch most days. He didn't talk about investments at dinner. He never casually dropped numbers into conversations to make sure everyone knew what bracket he belonged in. What he did have was a stable life. He paid his bills. He had savings. He had no significant consumer debt. He was careful with money without being obsessed with it. If something broke, his first instinct was to see whether it could be fixed. He wasn't cheap exactly. He just didn't seem to get emotional satisfaction from proving he could afford something. I liked that about him. Early in our relationship, I asked why he was so guarded when people asked about money. He said, "I've watched people turn income into character. I don't want to play that game." At the time, I thought that was just a personal quirk. Gavin had helped start a restoration and renovation company 8 years earlier. It handled commercial properties, water and fire damage restoration, structural repairs, and larger renovation jobs. He owned 28%. He wasn't secretly a billionaire. He didn't own a private jet or a mansion under another name. The company was simply established, profitable, and boring in the way healthy businesses often are. I knew that. I also knew roughly what his ownership meant financially because we had discussed our finances long before getting engaged. We had compared debts, savings, retirement accounts, insurance, and long-term plans. When we decided to sign a prenup, it wasn't because either of us distrusted the other. It was because we were both entering marriage with assets and business interests that existed before the relationship. We each had our own attorney. Gavin disclosed what he needed to disclose to me and to the lawyers. I did the same. Dad wanted more. The first time he asked, it was almost casual. We were having dinner with my parents and he asked Gavin, "What's the exact legal name of the company again?" Gavin told him. Dad nodded. "And you're an employee or a partner?" "Owner." "Percentage?" Gavin looked at me before answering. It wasn't a dramatic look. It was more like he was checking whether I had invited this conversation. I said, "Dad." "What?" Dad asked. "I'm making conversation," Gavin said. "I have an ownership stake." Dad smiled like Gavin had confirmed something. "Which means what?" "Which means I have an ownership stake." Brooke was there with her husband, Trevor. Trevor had always gotten along with Dad because he answered questions in the way Dad liked. Ask Trevor about compensation and he would give a range. Ask about retirement contributions and he would tell you the percentage. Trevor didn't see that as intrusive. To him it was just information. Dad liked information when he was the person collecting it. A few days later he called me and said he wanted Gavin to provide a financial statement before the wedding. I thought he meant for the prenup. I told him our attorneys were already handling everything. No, he said. I mean to me. I laughed because I genuinely thought he was joking. He wasn't. He wanted a list of Gavin's assets, income from the business, debts, business obligations, and enough documentation to verify that Gavin wasn't relying on me financially. I said, "Why would he give that to you?" "Because he's marrying my daughter." "That doesn't make you his bank." "It makes me someone with a responsibility to make sure you're protected." "I am protected. That's what the prenup is for." Dad went quiet for a second. Then he said, "A legal document doesn't tell me who a person is." That sentence would come back later. At first, I tried to treat the whole thing as a boundary issue that could be handled without a war. I told Gavin what Dad wanted. Gavin listened, leaned back in his chair, and rubbed his thumb over the edge of his coffee mug. Then he said, "No. Not angrily. Not theatrically. Just no." I asked if he would be willing to give Dad some general reassurance. Maybe confirm that the company was stable. Maybe give him a broad income range. Gavin asked, "Would that end it?" I knew the answer. No. Then I'd rather not start. A week later, Dad asked Gavin directly after a family dinner. He waited until my mother, Elaine, had brought out dessert, which was typical of him. He liked difficult conversations to happen in calm settings, because then anyone who got upset would look like the unreasonable one. He said, "I've asked Ashley to have you provide a basic financial disclosure." Gavin set down his fork. "I know. And I don't think that's appropriate." Dad's expression tightened. "Why?" "Because Ashley and I are handling our finances together with independent attorneys. I'll disclose what the agreement requires to Ashley and our attorneys. I'm not applying to marry her father." Brooke looked down at her plate. Trevor suddenly became very interested in his water. Mom said, "Gavin, I don't think Howard means it like that." Gavin looked at her. "How does he mean it?" Dad answered for her. "I mean that Ashley has spent her entire life with a certain level of stability. If you resent being asked whether you can contribute to that stability, I have to wonder why." Gavin said, "I don't resent the question. I resent the assumption behind it." Dad leaned back. "And what assumption is that?" "That I'm asking Ashley to support me." Dad didn't say yes. Instead he said, "You don't come from the same level she does." I felt heat crawl up my neck. "Dad." He held up one hand. "I'm not insulting him. I'm stating a fact." Gavin looked at me, not Dad. That was one of the things that made Dad dislike him most. Gavin didn't perform for him. I told Dad, "This conversation is over." It wasn't. For the next month, the requests became more specific. Dad asked me for the company's legal name again, even though he had already written it down. He asked how long it had been operating. "Almost 8 years, I said. At another dinner, he said, "A company that has been around nearly a decade should have decent records." I remember looking at him because I had never told him the exact age of the company. Gavin hadn't either, at least not in front of me. I assumed Dad had searched the state business registry. That seemed invasive but still within the realm of something a nosy father might do. Another time, Dad asked whether Gavin carried any personal guarantees connected to company debt. I told him I didn't know every detail because some things belonged to Gavin's business partners and were subject to confidentiality. Dad said, "That's not the part that worries me." I asked, "Then what does?" He changed the subject. Mom also said something strange around that time. I had called her after another argument with Dad and complained that he was treating my marriage like an acquisition. She sighed and said, "Your father has checked enough already." "What does that mean?" A beat passed. Then she said, "I mean he's asked enough questions." I accepted that answer because I wanted to. That's important. Looking back, there were signs. I didn't miss them because I was stupid. I missed them because I had spent my whole life translating my father's behavior into the most generous possible version. He was concerned. He was thorough. He was old-fashioned. He was trying to protect me. The wedding money became the next point of leverage. My parents had offered $31,000 toward the wedding. I had never asked for that exact amount. They volunteered it early in the planning, and because it was offered as a gift, Gavin and I built part of the budget around it. By the time Dad started threatening to withdraw it, we had signed contracts. The venue deposit was paid. The florist had a non-refundable portion. The band had a cancellation schedule. The catering package had already been revised once based on our final guest count. 12 days before the wedding, Dad called me. He said, "I'm giving you one last chance to handle this sensibly." I was sitting at my kitchen counter with a vendor spreadsheet open. I said, "If by sensibly you mean forcing Gavin to turn over private business records to you, then no. This is not about forcing anyone. You are literally threatening to pull money if he doesn't do it. I am choosing not to finance a decision I believe is reckless." I stared at the numbers on my laptop. "So you're pulling the wedding money? I'm not writing a check for a marriage that refuses basic transparency. We have a prenup." "Not with me." That answer snapped something into focus. I said, "Exactly." He was silent. Then he told me that if I wanted to prove I didn't need the family's judgment, I shouldn't expect the family's money either. I told him I understood. I didn't cry until after I hung up. Not because I thought the wedding was ruined. I knew Gavin and I could still get married. I cried because I finally understood that the gift had never been fully mine. It was a vote. And Dad had just withdrawn it because I had voted differently. The rehearsal dinner was 2 nights later. Mom had begged both of us to come. She said the larger family didn't need to know what was happening, and that Dad would cool off if no one embarrassed him. I should have known that meant she had asked me to preserve his dignity, not that he planned to preserve mine. Dinner was at a private room in a restaurant. It wasn't huge, but enough relatives were there that I could feel the social pressure of keeping things pleasant. Dad made a short toast. He started normally. He talked about marriage and responsibility and building a foundation. Then he turned toward me. "I want everyone here to understand something before rumors start," he said. My stomach dropped. Mom quietly said, "Howard." He kept going. "Ashley and I disagree about what responsible preparation for marriage looks like. She has chosen not to require certain basic assurances, and because of that, Elaine and I will not be funding the wedding as originally planned." That wasn't true. Mom hadn't made that decision. I knew from the way she looked at him. Brooke shifted in her chair. Dad said, "Adults are free to make their own choices. But adults also accept the consequences of those choices." Someone at the far end of the table cleared his throat. I said, "You didn't need to announce this." Dad said, "I am not ashamed of my decision." Gavin had been quiet beside me. Dad looked at him. "If you want to prove you're not marrying up, this was always very simple," Gavin said. "Keep it." Dad blinked. Gavin continued, "The money. Keep it." Dad gave a short laugh. "That's easy to say when Ashley will cover the difference." I felt Gavin's hand leave the back of my chair. For half a second I thought he was going to stand. He didn't. He said, "You have no idea what I cover, Howard. That's the point." Dad's face changed. Not surprise. Annoyance. That should have registered more than it did. Instead I stood up and said, "We're leaving." Mom followed us into the hallway. She looked close to tears. "Ashley, please. Your father is angry. So am I. He thinks he's protecting you." "From what?" She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Gavin touched my elbow. "We should go," Mom said. "If Gavin just shows him the numbers, Howard will put the money back." I looked at her. "No. Ashley. No. We're done negotiating my marriage price." That night, Gavin and I sat at the kitchen table and rebuilt the wedding budget. There was nothing romantic about it. We went line by line. The band became a DJ. The premium open bar became beer, wine, and 2 cocktails. We reduced the floral package and removed arrangements from several side tables. We cut upgraded linens. We dropped a late-night food station. We changed the menu from the most expensive entree option to a less complicated package. There were deposits we couldn't recover. We had to cover those. At one point, I stared at the florist revision and felt embarrassed before the wedding had even happened. I said, People are going to notice. Gavin looked at the page. Notice what? That we cut everything. They're going to notice we're married. You know what I mean. He did. He didn't tell me I was being silly. Instead, he said, I would rather marry you in a half-empty room than audition for him. That made me laugh when I didn't feel like laughing. The flowers we ended up choosing were simple white blooms with greenery. They were much less elaborate than the original package. When the florist emailed the final design, Gavin said, I like these better. You are lying. I'm not. Why? He shrugged. At least these are ours. The wedding was smaller in feel than I had pictured, but it was good. Not good in the dramatic sense of proving Dad wrong. There was no moment where everyone saw our modest flowers and suddenly understood the value of love. It was just our wedding. My dad came. He was polite. He didn't make a speech. He didn't apologize. When he hugged me after the ceremony, he said, I hope you know I love you. I said, I know you believe that. His arms stiffened around me. For the first couple of months after the wedding, I kept some distance from my parents without cutting them off. That was partly because I was angry and partly because I still thought time might help. Instead, Dad started managing the story. A cousin called me and asked whether Gavin had refused to sign a prenup. I told her no. He had signed one. An aunt asked whether Gavin had debts he had hidden from me. No. Someone else told Brooke they had heard Gavin wouldn't disclose his income to me. Also no. Every version had the same shape. Dad was a worried father asking normal questions, and Gavin was a defensive man with something to hide. Dad was careful, though. He never told people Gavin was unemployed. He never said Gavin had no business. He said things like, he doesn't have the foundation Ashley grew up with. Or, I don't think they're on equal footing. Or, there are things I wasn't comfortable with. At the time, I thought he was avoiding specifics because he didn't have them. 7 months after the wedding, I realized the opposite was true. The family partnership owned several commercial properties. My 15% interest came from my grandfather. Brooke had an interest too, and Dad managed the largest portion. I had spent years treating it as background wealth, which is embarrassing to admit. I knew the properties existed. I received statements. I received tax documents. I occasionally signed approvals. But I had let Dad handle most operational decisions because that was how the family did things. One property needed significant restoration and renovation before a refinance could be completed under favorable terms. There had been water intrusion and some deferred structural work. The lender wanted specific repairs completed, documented, and tied to an approved contractor scope. Because my ownership interest wasn't symbolic, the operating agreement required my signature for one of the refinancing approvals. Dad sent me the paperwork. Normally I would have skimmed it, asked 1 or 2 questions and signed. This time I read it. That alone irritated him. He called and said, Did you receive the documents? Yes. I need them back. I'm reviewing them. You've signed these before. I know. So what's different? I got married. He knew what I meant. He sighed. Ashley, don't mix personal issues into partnership business. I almost laughed. Instead, I said, send me the contractor package and the lender conditions. He did reluctantly. A week later, there was a project review with the lender's representative, Dad, me, and people involved with the renovation plan. 2 contractors had been shortlisted based on the process the lender and insurer required. I was reading the summary when I saw the company name. I read it twice. Then I looked at Dad. He was already looking at me. Gavin's company was the preferred contractor for the main restoration scope. For a few seconds, I assumed it had to be some bizarre coincidence involving a similar name. It wasn't. I texted Gavin from under the table. Is your company bidding on a project tied to my family partnership? He responded about a minute later. What property? I sent the identifying details. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then appeared again. Finally he wrote, I didn't know that client was yours. Let me make calls. Gavin didn't handle every bit personally. His company had multiple teams, estimators, project managers, and co-owners. The work had entered their pipeline through normal channels. Within an hour he called me. I just confirmed it, he said. I wasn't involved in the initial estimate. Did you know Dad was connected to it? No. Did anyone at the company? Not that I know of. The ownership entity name isn't your family's name. I believed him because the property sat inside an LLC under the partnership structure. Then Gavin said, I'm going to recuse myself from anything related to this. Okay. If the other owners think we should withdraw entirely, we will. That might not be necessary. It might be. We ended the call. I went back into the meeting. Dad asked, well, I said, Gavin confirmed it's his company. Dad didn't say, what? He didn't ask how much of it Gavin owned. He didn't ask why Gavin had never told him. He just pressed his fingers to his forehead and said, this complicates everything. I stared at him. That was the moment. Not the report. Not the $75,000. Not yet. Just one sentence. This complicates everything. I said, you don't seem surprised. Dad looked up. I knew he had some business involvement. Some business involvement? He told us he had an ownership stake. No, he told you he was an owner. You spent months acting like that meant nothing. Dad's mouth tightened. This is not the time. That was another sentence he used whenever the timing was bad for him. I went home with a feeling I couldn't shake. I called Mom the next morning. I didn't ask vaguely. I said, did Dad know Gavin owned 28% of his company before the wedding? Mom was quiet. Then she said, Ashley, your father was trying to be careful. My stomach dropped. That is not an answer. He had concerns. Did he know? He knew enough. I closed my eyes. There it was again. Enough. I said, what does enough mean? Mom lowered her voice, even though I had no idea whether Dad was near her. Your father had someone look into the business. I didn't say anything. She rushed to soften it. It was public information. Mostly. Business registrations, ownership information, whatever could be verified. He was worried and wanted facts. When? Before the wedding. How long before? I don't remember exactly. Try. She exhaled. 6 weeks. Maybe a little more. I sat at my kitchen table. 6 weeks before the wedding. That meant before he pulled the money. Before the rehearsal dinner. Before he told relatives Gavin wouldn't prove he had a foundation. I asked, did you see it? Mom said. Howard forwarded me a summary. Do you still have it? Ashley. Do you still have it? She did. At first she didn't want to send it. She said it would only make things worse. I told her, things are already worse. I just didn't know why. An hour later the email arrived. It was old and ugly and painfully ordinary. No secret spy dossier. No miraculous list of every account Gavin owned. It was a business and financial background summary, assembled from commercial databases and public records. It identified Gavin as a 28% owner in the company. It showed the company had been active for years. It listed no obvious bankruptcies or major judgments tied to him. It included enough information to show that he had a real ownership interest in a functioning business. It didn't prove Gavin was rich. It didn't prove he was a good husband. But it absolutely destroyed the version of events where Dad had believed Gavin was a man with nothing, refusing to answer questions because he planned to live off me. I read the report twice. Then I searched the forwarded email chain. Dad had written to Mom. This confirms the business piece. I still don't like the lack of transparency. The date was more than a month before he withdrew the wedding money. I felt something colder than anger. Dad hadn't misunderstood Gavin. He had changed the accusation. Once he knew Gavin had real business ownership, the issue became character. Once Gavin signed a prenup, the issue became transparency. Once I said I knew Gavin's finances, the issue became family standards. The requirement was never going to be satisfied because the requirement was obedience. That afternoon, I waited for Gavin to get home. I placed my phone on the table with the email open. He took one look at my face and said, "What happened?" I asked. "Did my father ever approach you without me before the wedding?" Gavin stopped. That pause told me almost everything. I said, "Do not protect me right now. Just answer." He sat down across from me. "Yes." "How many times?" "Twice alone. Once he tried to catch me after dinner, but I left." "What did he want?" Gavin looked down at his hands. "The first time, the same thing he wanted from you. Financials." "And the second?" He didn't answer immediately. I said, "Gavin." "He offered me money." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so absurdly predictable that my body didn't know what else to do. "How much?" $75,000. "For what?" "To end the engagement." I stared at him. He kept talking because he knew silence would make it worse. "He said I could tell you we weren't compatible. He said no one had to know about the money." "When was this?" "After the background check, apparently. I didn't know about the report." "You took the meeting after he pulled that kind of stunt?" "I didn't know what he wanted when he asked to talk." "What did you say?" "No. Just no." I told him there wasn't an amount. "And then you came home and said nothing to me." He flinched. That was the first moment in the entire situation when my anger at Gavin came close to my anger at my father. I stood up and walked to the other side of the kitchen. "You let me walk into that rehearsal dinner not knowing he tried to buy you out of my life." "I know." "You let me spend weeks thinking this was about financial disclosure." "I know." "You watched me defend him to myself." "I wasn't defending him." "You didn't give me the information I needed to understand what he was doing." Gavin stood too. "I thought telling you would make you cut him off before the wedding." I turned around. "Maybe I would have. That's why I didn't tell you." The answer landed badly. He realized it as soon as he said it. I said, "You refused his money, but you still let him decide what information I was allowed to have." "That's not what I meant. I know your reasons were different." "Ashley." "No. This matters." He rubbed both hands over his face. "I didn't want you marrying me because you were furious at him. I didn't want the wedding to become a referendum on Howard. I thought if I told you, he'd be in the middle of everything." "He was already in the middle of everything." "I know that now." "You knew enough then." That phrase came out harsher than I intended because it was my mother's phrase. Gavin looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "You're right. I wanted to keep fighting. Part of me wanted him to defend himself so I could stay angry cleanly. Instead he said, I made a decision about what you could handle because I thought my reason was good. I shouldn't have. That didn't fix it. But it mattered." We slept in the same bed that night with about 2 feet of empty mattress between us. For the next few days I separated the two problems in my head. One problem was my marriage. Gavin had withheld something that directly affected me. His motive hadn't been money or manipulation, but the result was still that he decided I shouldn't know something about my own father. That had to be dealt with between us. The other problem was the family partnership. I had spent years letting Dad use my passivity as authority. That needed to stop regardless of whether I stayed angry at him. So I did something that annoyed him more than yelling would have. I asked for documents. I requested full partnership accounting for the previous several years. I asked for the operating agreement and all amendments. I asked for a current statement of my capital account. I asked for copies of correspondence related to the refinance. I notified the administrator that I didn't want future distributions automatically reinvested until further notice. Then I hired my own attorney to review the partnership agreement and an independent valuation professional to explain what my 15% interest actually represented. Dad called within a day. "What are you doing?" "Reviewing my investment." "You don't need a lawyer to review something I've managed for years." "I do if I don't understand it." "You understand it." "No. I understand that I trusted you to handle it." "Same thing." "It isn't." His voice hardened. "Did Gavin tell you to do this?" There it was. I said, no. Because this suddenly looks a lot like your husband is trying to interfere with family assets. My husband just learned his company bid on our project and immediately removed himself from the decision. That doesn't mean he isn't influencing you. I almost said something cruel. Instead, I asked, why is it easier for you to believe Gavin controls me than to believe I'm making a decision you don't like? He didn't answer. Later that day, Brooke called. She didn't ease into it. Dad says you're holding up the refinance. I'm reviewing it. The financing window matters. I know. Then why are you doing this now? Because now is when I realized I have been signing things I don't fully understand. Come on, Ashley. What? You are angry about the wedding. Yes. And suddenly the partnership needs an independent valuation. Also yes. Those things are connected. They are. Just not the way Dad says. Brooke sighed. You're allowed to be angry at Dad. That does not mean the rest of us have to absorb the cost of it. That irritated me because it wasn't completely wrong. I told her, I'm not trying to tank the project. Then sign. I am not signing because that's what I always do. Do you know what happens if this gets delayed? I know there are costs. My money is in this too. I know. She was quiet. Then she said, you always do this. Do what? You make Dad the villain and then act like no one else has a stake. I nearly hung up. Instead, I said, he called my husband a gold digger after confirming he owned part of a stable company. Brooke said, ownership doesn't automatically make someone a good person. The exact logic Dad would later use. I said, no, but it makes, he has nothing, a dishonest argument. Dad never said he had literally nothing. That technicality made me laugh. Brooke got angry. This is what I mean. You want everyone to admit Dad is evil before you'll act reasonably. I don't think he's evil. Could have fooled me. We ended the call badly. Meanwhile, Gavin spoke to his co-owners. He told them about the family connection. The decision was made without me in the room, and without Dad having any input. Because Gavin's ownership and marriage created the appearance of a conflict, the company withdrew from the bid rather than try to structure around it. Gavin told me that evening. They're pulling out. All the way. Yes. That was the preferred bid. I know. Did they have to? No. But it's cleaner. I knew what that contract could have meant for the company. I also knew he hadn't asked me to pressure my family to keep them in. I said, I'm sorry. He shrugged, but not convincingly. It's business. You're allowed to be annoyed. I'm annoyed. At me. At the situation. That wasn't the same as no. The replacement contractor was about $46,000 higher on the main scope once everything was reconciled. Dad called me as soon as he found out. So now he gets to punish me through his company too? I had been reading the revised contractor comparison. I said, he removed himself. He removed the best priced option. Because you spent months telling people he was after our money. Do you really want his company profiting from a partnership I'm in, while you're accusing him of influencing me? He could have stepped away personally. His co-owners decided otherwise. Convenient. You're the one calling every consequence a punishment. Dad hung up on me. My mother called an hour later. Can we get through this one thing first? She asked. I knew what she meant. Sign the refinance. Then discuss everything else later. That had been our family method for years. Get through the wedding. Get through the holiday. Get through the closing. Get through Dad's mood. Get through the next thing that supposedly mattered more than the problem. I said, no. Ashley, the project is already more expensive. I know. Your father is under a lot of pressure. I know. Then why make this harder? Because every time I wait for a calmer time, we all go back to normal. Mom was quiet. I continued, and normal is Dad making decisions, you translating them, Brooke defending the practical side, and me eventually signing. That's not fair. It isn't completely unfair either. She sounded tired when she said, your father just worries differently. I said, Please stop saying that to me. She inhaled sharply. I'm not asking you to choose sides. I'm asking you to stop carrying his messages. That was the first boundary my mother actually respected. She didn't call again on his behalf. My attorney confirmed what I had finally bothered to learn. Dad couldn't force my signature. I couldn't destroy the partnership or take assets unilaterally either. My 15% came with actual rights and actual obligations. Under the operating agreement, certain refinancing actions required specified approvals. There was also a buyout mechanism that could be triggered under particular conditions, with valuation procedures and a structured payment schedule, rather than an immediate cash payout. For the first time in years, I understood my own position. That embarrassed me almost as much as the wedding flowers once had. I had spent years saying I was financially independent while allowing someone else to explain my own assets to me. The partnership meeting happened a little over 2 weeks later. It wasn't a dramatic family summit. It was Dad, Mom, Brooke, me, and the people who needed to be there for the partnership discussion. Gavin wasn't a partner and didn't attend. Before I left home, Gavin asked, "What are you planning to say about the offer?" I knew exactly which offer. I said, "I don't know." He looked at me. "I'd rather you didn't use that." "Why?" "Because I told you." He didn't confess it. He made it part of the same pattern. I know. He is still telling people you hid your finances because you wanted access to family money. I know. Then why protect him? I'm not protecting him. What are you protecting? Gavin took a moment. Us, maybe. I didn't like that answer either. He continued, "I should have told you. I've admitted that. But telling the entire partnership meeting turned something I did not want weaponized into a weapon. It's evidence. It's also my private conversation." I looked at him. He said, "I'm not telling you what you can say. I'm telling you I won't like it if you say it." That was fairer than forbidding me. I kissed him goodbye without resolving it. At the meeting, Dad was composed. That usually meant he believed he still had control of the outcome. He went through the project numbers, the revised contractor cost, the lender timeline, and the consequences of further delay. Then he looked at me. "We need Ashley's approval today," I said. "Before that, I want to clarify something." Dad's expression changed. "Ashley." I kept my voice even. "Did you hire a financial background service to investigate Gavin before the wedding?" Brooke looked at Dad. Mom looked at the table. Dad said, "This is exactly the kind of personal issue that doesn't belong in a partnership meeting." I disagree because you've said my marriage is influencing my judgment about partnership money. It is. Then your actions regarding my marriage are relevant to the accusation. Dad folded his hands. I did basic due diligence. On my fiancé. Yes. Without telling me. I was concerned. And the report confirmed he owned 28% of a company that had been operating for years. Dad's jaw tightened. Brooke looked at Mom. "Is that true?" Mom spoke before Dad could. "Yes." Dad turned toward her. She said quietly, "You sent me the summary." Nobody gasped. Nobody shouted. That almost made it worse. Brooke just stared at Dad like she was recalculating something. I asked, "So when you pulled the $31,000 12 days before the wedding and told people Gavin had no foundation you trusted, you already knew he had a real ownership interest in an established business?" Dad said, "I knew he had a business interest. That did not answer my concerns." "What concerns?" "Character." I almost smiled because it was so exact. "A company share does not tell me whether a man is safe for my daughter," he said. I said, "No, it doesn't." That seemed to surprise him. I continued, "And you were allowed to have concerns. You were allowed to dislike him. You were allowed to advise me. What you were not entitled to do was keep moving the standard every time he met the last one." I did not move anything. He agreed to a prenup. That wasn't enough. I told you I knew his finances. That wasn't enough. You confirmed he owned a legitimate business. That wasn't enough. What exactly would have been enough? Transparency. To you. To the family. No. To you. Dad leaned forward. If he had nothing to hide, why was it so difficult to answer reasonable questions? I said. Because he wasn't marrying you. Brooke cut in. Okay, but Ashley, you're acting like the report proved Dad wrong about everything. I didn't say that. You are using it that way. Dad said. Thank you. I held up a hand. Brooke is right about one part. The report doesn't prove Gavin's character. She looked surprised that I agreed. I continued, but Dad already had evidence that his financial story about Gavin was misleading, and he kept using it anyway. Dad said, I was protecting you. I looked at him. Was offering him $75,000 to leave me also protection? I felt the moment change. Not like a movie. Just like everyone stopped trying to predict the next sentence. Mom looked at Dad. Brooke said, What? Dad's face went flat. Ashley. I knew immediately from his tone that Gavin had been telling the truth. I said, You offered Gavin $75,000 to end our engagement and tell me we weren't compatible. Mom whispered, Howard. Dad looked at her. It was an option. Brooke actually pushed back from the table. An option. Dad said, He refused it. That is not the point, I said. Dad turned to me. Apparently it should be. If he refused, then by your own logic he proved something. I stared at him. Even then, he was trying to convert the event into one of his tests. I said, You don't get credit because the man you tried to bribe didn't take the bribe. Dad's voice rose for the first time. I was trying to find out whether he could be bought. No. You were trying to make him go away. You don't know that. He told me what you said. Dad glanced toward the door as though Gavin might be standing outside it. Then Brooke said, Wait. She looked at me. Gavin told you this when? A couple weeks ago. He knew before the wedding? Yes. And he didn't tell you? I hesitated. That hesitation gave her the answer. Brooke sat back. So Dad isn't the only one who decided you shouldn't know something. Dad said. Exactly. I turned toward him. Don't use that. Why not? It happens to be true. I looked at Brooke instead. She's right. Brooke blinked. I continued. Gavin should have told me. We have already had that fight. He made a decision for me because he thought he was protecting me. I told him that was wrong. Dad said. But somehow I am the monster for doing the same thing. No. You are responsible for what you did. Gavin is responsible for what he did. I don't have to pretend one wrong cancels the other. Dad's mouth tightened. Brooke said, And what about what you're doing to us? That was the question I had known was coming. She tapped the refinance packet. You know this delay costs money. You know the second contractor is more expensive. You know the financing terms can get worse if this drags. At what point is your boundary just revenge with a legal document attached? I didn't have a perfect answer. That mattered too. I said, Part of me is angry enough that timing affects how this feels. Brooke gave a short, humorless laugh. At least you admit it. I do. But I also know I am never going back to signing because Dad says the family needs me to. Dad said, Nobody asked you to sign blind. You expected me to. I expected you to trust my management. I did. For years. And it benefited you. Yes. That answer stopped him briefly. I continued. You were not always wrong. You taught me useful things. You protected me from bad decisions before. That's part of why I let this go on so long. His face softened just slightly. Then I said, But being right before doesn't give you permanent authority. He leaned back. What do you want? That was the first useful question he had asked me. I had spent the previous 2 weeks figuring out the answer. I am not signing the refinance today. Brooke muttered something under her breath. I kept going. I want the independent valuation completed. I want my distributions handled separately going forward. And I'm triggering the buyout process for my 15% interest under the operating agreement. Dad stared at me. For the first time since the meeting started, he looked genuinely surprised. You're selling out. I'm asking to be bought out under the agreement. Why? Because I don't want this relationship anymore. This partnership is part of your future. I know. Your grandfather put that interest in your name for a reason. I know. Do you understand the upside you're walking away from? Yes. He shook his head. No, you don't. I almost fell into the old argument. The one where I tried to prove I understood enough to earn the right to decide. Instead, I said, then it will be my expensive mistake. Dad looked furious. That sentence removed the last piece of leverage. If I was willing to make a mistake he couldn't prevent, what was left for him to manage? He said, you are doing this because of him. I said, I'm doing this because of me. He looked away. The meeting ended without my signature. The project didn't collapse. That is important. There was no financial apocalypse. No one lost everything. Dad and the other relevant parties adjusted. The refinance was delayed. The terms were somewhat less favorable by the time the revised structure moved forward. The replacement contractor cost roughly $46,000 more on the restoration scope. There were additional professional fees and carrying costs because of the delay. Dad could afford the consequences. He just hated that they existed. For months, he described every one of those costs as damage I had caused. I described them as the cost of no longer agreeing automatically. The truth was probably somewhere less satisfying. My timing did increase pressure. His choices created the conditions. Gavin's company lost a contract it might otherwise have won. Brooke's expected returns were affected. My own investment value became part of a longer negotiation. Nobody walked away untouched. The buyout process took time. There was a valuation. Then there was disagreement about the valuation assumptions. Then there were lawyers exchanging language about payment schedules, tax treatment, and transfer mechanics. Eventually, we reached a structured arrangement under the partnership terms. I would be paid out over multiple years. It wasn't a giant check placed dramatically in my hand. It was a schedule. Dates, percentages, signatures, conditions. The boring paperwork of separating money from family. Dad hated that I accepted it. He kept telling me I was giving up long-term appreciation. He was probably right. That was the hardest part for me to explain to people who saw the buyout as some kind of victory. I didn't outsmart my father financially. I may make less money because I left. The point was that staying meant every future distribution, refinance, acquisition, and approval could become another place where family loyalty and financial consent blurred together. I didn't want the leverage anymore, even when the leverage might benefit me. Brooke stayed angry for months. We went from talking several times a week to exchanging short texts on birthdays and practical family matters. When we finally had lunch again, she said, I still think you picked the most damaging possible time. I said, I probably picked the first time I was willing to accept the damage. She didn't like that answer, but she didn't argue. A few minutes later, she said, Dad was wrong about Gavin. That was as close as she got to apologizing for repeating the gold digger story. I said, thank you. Then she added, I still think Gavin is weird about money. I laughed. That's fair. Mom changed too, though more quietly. One day she came over without Dad. She sat at my kitchen table and said, I should have told you about the report. Yes. I told myself it was just your father being cautious. I know. I kept thinking if everyone calmed down it would stop. I looked at her. Did it ever stop when everyone calmed down? She smiled sadly. No. She apologized, but not in a perfect way. She still said Dad had been scared. She still believed some of his concern came from love. I could accept that. Love and control are not mutually exclusive. I didn't need to turn him into a cartoon villain to admit what he had done. What mattered more was that Mom stopped calling me with messages that began, Your father thinks. If Dad wanted to tell me something, he had to tell me himself. My marriage took longer to settle. Gavin and I didn't have one conversation and magically repair the issue. For weeks, small things triggered it. If he said, I didn't mention it because I didn't want you worrying, I would go still. If I made a decision affecting both of us before talking to him, he would point out that I wasn't exactly modeling the transparency I was demanding. The biggest unresolved issue was the meeting. He believed I had the right to expose Dad's offer, because it was relevant to the pattern of financial pressure. He also believed I had used a private conversation he had trusted me with after specifically asking me not to. Both things were true. One night, maybe 2 months after the meeting, we were sitting on the couch with the television paused because neither of us was watching it. Gavin said, "You keep saying I decided for you." "You did." "I know. But at the meeting you decided for me too." I didn't answer. He said, "You decided that because telling the truth served the bigger issue. My preference didn't matter." "Your preference would have protected my father." "Maybe. Or maybe I didn't want one of the worst conversations I've ever had repeated to your family." I looked at him. He wasn't angry. That made it harder. I said, "I thought if I didn't say it, Dad would keep pretending this was just a financial disagreement." "He probably would have." "Then what was I supposed to do?" "You could have told me before the meeting that you had decided to use it." I opened my mouth, then closed it. Because he was right. Not about everything, but about that. I had been so focused on refusing control that I had ignored consent in the other direction. I said, "I'm sorry." He nodded. I continued, "I still think it needed to come out." "I know. But I should have told you I was going to say it." "Yes." That became our rule. Not total disclosure of every thought, conversation, or private detail. Neither of us wanted to live like that. The rule was simpler. If information directly affected the other person's life, reputation, finances, or ability to make a decision, we didn't get to hide it, for their own good. If we wanted to delay sharing something because the timing was bad, we had to say that too. No secret protection. No benevolent editing. Sounds obvious. It wasn't obvious to either of us until we failed at it. Dad and I went several months without a real conversation. Then he asked to meet. We sat across from each other at a quiet restaurant. He looked older than he had at the rehearsal dinner, though I knew that was probably just because I was seeing him differently. He said, "I don't agree with how you handled the partnership." "I know. I still think Gavin should have been more forthcoming." "I know. I had a right to be concerned." "You had a right to be concerned." He looked at me carefully, as though waiting for the argument. I didn't give him one. Finally he said, "Things went too far." That was his apology. Or as close as he could get. I could have asked him which things. The background investigation? The $75,000 offer? Pulling the wedding money? Humiliating us at the rehearsal dinner? Calling my husband a risk after he had evidence that at least some of his assumptions were wrong? I didn't. I already knew he would separate each action into a defensible little box. Concern. Due diligence. Testing intentions. Protecting family assets. Teaching consequences. He would never say the sentence I had wanted for months. "I used money because I was afraid you would choose differently if I could not control the terms." I no longer needed him to say it. I said, "They did." He nodded. We ate lunch. That was it. Our relationship is polite now. Not close in the old way. Sometimes I miss that closeness. I also have to admit that some of what I miss was certainty. Dad always had an answer. He always knew which form to sign, which deal looked suspicious, which repair estimate was inflated, which financial choice was smart. There was comfort in letting someone else be that sure. Independence is less comfortable than I expected. There are decisions I make now without knowing whether they are optimal. There is money I may never earn because I sold my partnership interest. There are family dinners where Brooke and I avoid certain topics. There are holidays where Dad and Gavin speak politely and little. There is no clean victory. The final buyout documents were signed almost a year after the partnership meeting. When the last signature was done, I expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt tired. I came home, made coffee, and sat on the floor in front of a cabinet where I had put our wedding album. I hadn't opened it in months. Most of the photos were exactly what you would expect. Family lined up in uncomfortable poses. Gavin laughing during the ceremony. My mother adjusting my veil. Brooke holding a drink and making a face at the camera. Then I reached a page with a close-up of the table flowers. The cheap ones, according to the version of me who had been panicking 12 days before the wedding. Simple white flowers and greenery. When I turned the page, something thin slipped loose. A dried white petal had been pressed between the pages. I remembered standing at the kitchen table with the revised florist quote, and worrying that everyone would know we had cut back. I remembered Gavin looking at the new arrangement and saying, "At least these are ours." At the time I thought he meant the flowers. Now I think he meant the decision. Maybe he didn't even know he meant that. I kept the petal in the album. I still do not regret refusing to sign the refinance that day. I still do not regret leaving the partnership. I do regret not warning Gavin before I told the family about the $75,000 offer, even though I believe the truth mattered. And I can admit that if I had discovered everything 6 months later, when there was no financing deadline, some of my choices might have looked less like retaliation. But that is also the point I had been avoiding for most of my adult life. There was always going to be a deadline. Always a deal. Always a holiday. Always a reason to keep the peace until later. Eventually, later had become the system. So I stopped waiting for a version of the conflict where setting a boundary cost nobody anything. The flowers in our album were not the ones I originally wanted. The investment I walked away from may someday be worth more than the buyout I accepted. My father still does not fully believe he was wrong. My husband and I had to repair something real after learning that good intentions do not make secrecy harmless. None of that changed the decision. For the first time in my life, family money stopped being a vote on whether I was allowed to choose for myself. If you liked it, don't forget to leave a comment and support the channel by subscribing. See you in the upcoming stories.